Take a look at the Zoloft advertisement. They're advertising a drug that treats social anxiety disorder. Social anxiety disorder is one of the most commonly diagnosed forms of mental illness. This diagnosis identifies individuals who experience intense fear, anxiety, or avoidance associated with social situations. It first appeared in the DSM-3 and was known as social phobia in 1980. There was some controversy about whether this disorder should be included in the most recent edition of the DSM, especially in terms of how individuals with this diagnosis can be distinguished from individuals who are shy. Research demonstrates that nearly 50% of North Americans demonstrate the symptoms of shyness. Estimates of the number of Americans with social anxiety disorder differs depending on the definition of social anxiety disorder. When the DSM defined social anxiety disorder as a persistent irrational fear of and compelling desire to avoid social situations, only an estimated 2.3% of Americans met the criterion for diagnosis of the disorder. When the definition changed to an unreasonably strong fear of social situations, the figure jumped to 13.3% of Americans. This is a reminder that the way we define and classify mental illnesses has a big impact on the diagnosis of individuals. Many sociologists argue that the increasing rates of attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, reflect the medicalization of normal childhood misbehavior. Recall the figure from your reading folder that demonstrated the rates of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder diagnoses among children in Canada by their month of birth. We can see that there is a linear relationship with time. If you are born later in the year, you are more likely to be diagnosed as having ADHD when you are school-aged. One possible explanation for this is related to the ages of children in the classroom. In Canada, December 31st is the birthday cutoff for determining when students begin school. Because of this, students born in January are always the oldest students in their class, and those born in December are the youngest. Some researchers argue that ADHD diagnoses are being influenced by the maturity of the students. Younger students tend to be less mature, more active, and less focused than their peers. These behaviors can be classified as symptoms of ADHD, leading to higher rates of diagnosis among younger, relative to their peers, less mature children. The increasing medicalization of formerly normal human behavior has benefits. First, it makes it easier to identify and validate the challenges that people face, as well as to develop conventional strategies for dealing with these difficulties. Second, it reduces blame on individuals. We are less likely to blame someone for their behavior when we understand that they are suffering from a mental disorder. However, there are criticisms of increasing medicalization as well. Critics argue that there is too much focus on pharmaceutical intervention rather than behavioral or therapeutic interventions. This is a problem because it reduces attention to how society can better address the needs of some individuals. Also, critics argue that misdiagnoses are occurring, whereby many individuals that see commercials on TV end up asking for prescriptions for drugs that they don't necessarily need. Meanwhile, the pharmaceutical industry has grown into one of the most profitable industries in the world. Other critics argue that labeling individuals as mentally ill causes further problems. Labeling theory in criminology argues that labeling a person as a deviant may make them more likely to engage in future deviance. So once someone begins to identify as a criminal, they're more likely to act like a criminal. Similarly, by labeling someone as mentally ill, individuals may view them as strange as a result of the diagnosis, and this may lead the individual to experience social stigma and isolation. They may also come to view themselves as less capable and trustworthy. In this way, labeling someone as mentally ill may make their lives more difficult rather than aid them in improving their well-being. This idea is connected to Erving Goffman's work discussed below, as well as Rosenhan's research that you will read for this module. The sociologist Erving Goffman studied mental institutions in the 1960s. He discovered that being labeled mentally ill creates a social stigma for those with this label and leads to exclusion from full participation in society. He found that most mental institutions are dehumanizing. The patients there are often discredited by doctors and nurses. He found that the feelings and opinions of the patients are generally not taken seriously. The patients are socially isolated from the rest of society and are not allowed to participate in normal social activities. They are also encouraged to take on the mental patient identity, helpless and incompetent. Goffman argued that these experiences are not useful to reintegration into society, and that they therefore aren't necessarily helpful in curing patients. He advocated an alternative form to mental health treatment based on deinstitutionalization and community-based interventions. He believed that this approach would reduce social stigma and social isolation, which would better support those struggling with challenges to their mental health to integrate into society. Critics who were inspired by Goffman, Rosenhan, and the sociological approach to mental illness argue that our society should develop ways to address mental illness that do not lead to stigma. This would include focusing on assisting individuals in changing the behaviors that are creating problems in their lives, rather than so much emphasis on diagnosing or labeling these challenges. They also advocate for describing symptoms as problems with living, many of which are a part of the normal range of life experiences. For example, temporary challenges with symptoms of depression, rather than viewing them as problems with individuals themselves.